Good morning. It is still morning, although we're having lunch. So it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 5th Annual Open African Innovation Research Partnership Distinguished Speaker Series. So on behalf of my co-director, Professor Jeremy De Beer, and the open air community at University of Ottawa Hub, I gratefully acknowledge the presence of representatives from the diplomatic community, our funders, IDRC and SHEC, our home institute, the Center for Law, Technology and Society, and our sister institute, the Institute of the Environment, and of course, the University of Ottawa. I will specifically thank Dr. Adele L. Siam, the Internationalization Officer of the University of Ottawa. Adele is here from the Office of the President of the University, and he is perhaps the single most experienced Canadian in internationalization of university education. His office underscores the priority University of Ottawa attaches to internationalization, and it attaches also to Africa, and the support the Open Air Research Partnership draws from his office in the execution of our projects. Adele has kindly agreed to introduce today's distinguished speaker, but before he does that, I wanted to mention that today's distinguished speaker is a critical partner with the Open Air. As some of you have already read, he is the Vice Chancellor or President of Lagos State University in southwestern Nigeria. We have partnered with him and held perhaps one of the most successful international outing we had in training African researchers in research grant writing and execution. So it is our greatest pleasure to have him come and speak with us on a very critical and cutting-edge topic. And therefore, I will have Adele come and make a formal welcome to our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, hi. Bonjour. We are bilingual university, so at least we try to speak the two languages, or to some extent, but I can speak both, and even I can speak Arabic if you want. So as my colleague said, I am the Chief Internationalization Officer at the university, and it really gave me great pleasure to be with you today for several reasons. Jeremy knows some of them. I will mention some of them. But allow me first to thank you, all of you, thank the Open Air team, thank Mr. Vice Chancellor for joining us here. It's a very important lecture. It's a very important topic too. And Professor Landry Fakbohan, who is a professor and Vice Chancellor President of the university, I want first of all to welcome you and thank you to be here with us. But allow me to say a few words first. I want just to give maybe a personal note. A few years ago, I would say a long time ago, I was a specialist of IT, information technology, with IDRC, the International Development Research Center. And I remember, Jeremy, we met, I don't remember the year, 2005, 2006, something like that. And I was one of the members of the team who really evaluated the first, I would say, version of the Open Air project and how they were looking to work with several partners in Africa. And personally, I'm very, I would say, touched and honored to see, like 10 years later, where you are now and how you are really impacting policy in terms of all things open. So it gives me really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. The topic of climate change and justice and the role of technology, innovation, and politics on the climate change is very important for the university, and I would say both because it's about the climate change, about sustainability, about the policy, but also because we have today an African scholar who will share with us. And Africa is very important for the university. We have today on our campus about 2,000 African students in all degrees, all programs, which is a very important number. We have about 8,000 international students. Yesterday, I heard somebody on the radio saying we have 6,000 Chinese students. It's not true. I would love to have 6,000 Chinese, but in total, we have 8,000 international students. 2,000 of them are from Africa, from different countries in Africa, studying in both languages, French and English. We have also an African strategy. We are developing a lot with African institutions. We have many collaboration in Africa, going from some programs, some scholarships, to research and consulting or policy development. On climate change, I want to maybe invite you to visit, if you don't know this office. We have an office at this university called the Office of Campus Sustainability. It's an office in charge of promoting sustainability and all the initiatives the university is taking in terms of courses, research, facility management, all of these issues. So I feel like we don't know all what this office is doing, but I would like really to invite you to visit this, the site of the Office of Campus Sustainability. And finally, recently the university joined an international alliance called U7 Alliance, the universities of G7 countries of the G7, but we are 45 universities from 18 countries, not only from 7 countries. And one of the main topics this alliance will be working on is climate change and policy influence on climate change. So allow me now to introduce Professor Lanre Fagbohan. He is one of the Nigeria's celebrated voices in the area of environmental law and advocacy for environmental preservation. He is native of Akesan in Alimosho local government area of Lagos State. He studied at the University of Ife and University of Lagos. He earned a bachelor in law, master in law, and doctorate degree from the same university. Dr. Fagbohan is very, I would say, prolific and very productive in terms of publication, in terms of reports, articles, etc. And we really appreciate your participation, your presence among us, but also your support to the open air projects. Professor Fagbohan is currently the 8th substantive Vice Chancellor of the Lagos State University. Welcome to University of Ottawa.
What role am I playing here today? What role? Why am I here? I want to ask, am I a consultant here today? Or a defense attorney in respect of climate change? If I'm a consultant, then those of you who are scared of extinction of the human race that is here today will have to pay me because I'm your consultant. But if we're talking about climate change issues in terms of me being a defense attorney, then I think I owe you the obligation to say thank you for giving me this platform to come here this afternoon. Very esteemed audience, I feel very privileged to have been invited to be a part of this conversation. I want to thank Open Air and the partners for the opportunity of the presentation. I also want to thank my 2 brothers from another mother, Jeremy and Chidi. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And I must say a very huge thank you to Victoria. Thank you so much. You have made my life so easy the last couple of days in the way you are seamlessly planning the event. Thank you very much. Edel, thank you for the very nice comments you've made about me. I appreciate it so much. I was suspecting that I may not be able to say the thank you sufficiently enough. So I asked my 2 boys, who are also studying in Canada here, to come around. Farouk, Samad, just show your hands. Thank you. Let me now come to the buzz phrase, climate change. A few days back, September 23rd, the United Nations was very much at it, discussing the issue of climate change. And it will appear that everybody is beginning to come to terms with the fact that climate crisis is worsening and that there's a need for all of us to have our hands on deck. What do we do? Most of what I'm going to be saying here today are things that you have heard before. You must have read it somewhere or listened to it at some other conferences. But I suspect what I'm going to be doing is sharing my own perspectives of what I think should be happening a lot more than what we are doing currently at the moment. Mark my words, I'm not saying we should jettison and throw away what is happening in terms of activities that are ongoing. And I will show that in a couple of moments. But there are some other areas where the emphasis should be. And that is where I'm going to be putting the emphasis of my conversation with you this morning. Why climate change injustice? Why am I not talking about climate change justice? Climate justice. Because that is the narrative that most of us are used to. We believe that, yes, those who contributed to the problem of climate change, they ought to be held responsible. And for those who are the victims of it, the vulnerable communities, we say that there's a need for justice in their favor. Again, we look at adaptive capacity of those who are the vulnerable lots. And we feel that there's so much that they need for them to be able to withstand what is on ground. And then we also talk about justice in their favor. But what I am bringing to the table today is slightly different from that. We have identified that in relation to those who contributed. We have identified that in relation to those who will be talking about lack of adaptive capacity. This morning, what I'm pushing to you is that even the narrative of climate justice that we are pushing, there is so much of injustice in that narrative. We are pushing a frontier for something. And we have continued for 27 years now to push it aggressively, which no doubt is good. But what I'm saying is, unwittingly, if we are not careful, what we are pushing is a frontier of injustice. And I noted here in my paper that the thesis statement for my presentation this morning is that current global narrative of climate justice has taken and continue to take on so much of injustice. So how do we manage that? Two broad reasons I will talk about in relation to this and why we need to be looking at some other perspectives. But as an African, we love stories. So I'm going to tell you two stories to identify those two broad areas that I'm talking about. I'm going to tell you the story of the hat seller and the monkeys. And I'm also going to tell you the story of the lawyer and his rare cigars. What is the story of the hat seller and his monkeys? There was this hat seller. It's a family business. One day he was going through the forest and he became tired. He decided to have a nap. He sat under the tree and slept off. By the time he woke up, all the hats that he was selling around, everything was up in the tree. Monkeys scattered everywhere. They were holding his hats. And the man thought to himself, how do I get out of this dilemma? He did something like this, that what do I do? And he saw that the monkeys did the same thing. He scratched his head that, wait a minute, are they copying me? Copycat syndrome. And he saw that they were doing the same thing. So what he did was, he picked the hat that he had left with him, the one hat that he had left with him, and threw it on the floor. And all the monkeys threw their hats on the floor. And he picked his hat and he left. 50 years later, I told you it's a family business. 50 years later, his son was passing around the area similarly circumstanced. Of course, his grandfather had already told him his exploits. So, when he took the nap and he slept off and he found the hats, he found them in the trees with the monkeys. He said, I knew what to do. He tried the first one. The monkeys did the same thing. He scratched his head. The monkeys did the same thing. Then he threw the hat on the floor. The monkeys did not do that. Then, the bigger of the monkeys came to meet him and told him, you think you're the only one that has a grandfather. I'll come back to you on why I've told you that story. But let me go to the second story. The lawyer and his, don't worry, I'm not going to spend more than 30 minutes so that I'll be able to take comments and questions. The lawyer and his rear seekers. This lawyer, Tosh, he went ahead and bought these rear seekers. And because he felt these are rear seekers, he went ahead and insured them. He insured the seekers. And the insurance company, they took the premium, everything was settled. Then gradually, one after the other, he consumed his cigar. And then he went ahead and laid a claim. He put forward a claim that he wants to collect, he wants to claim on the policy. When he put forward the claim, the insurance company just went berserk. Said, wait a minute, you consumed your cigar in the normal course of event, so why are you making a claim for it? The lawyer didn't mind that, he just sued. And when they got to court, the insurance company said, sorry, my lord, he cannot make a claim because he burned the cigarette. The judge looked at the insurance policy and said, I'm sorry, I cannot find anywhere here where you have exempted certain types of fires. So you gave room for any kind of fire, and fire has consumed it. So small fires, any kind of fire, the cigars are gone, you have to pay. So $15,000 in favor of the man. Even though it is frivolous, the judge said, even though it is frivolous, I have to go by the terms of the contract. And they paid him. The expectation was that the insurance company will appeal. The insurance company did not. They paid. He collected his money. Then, a week later, of course, the investigators came to meet him, and they charged him to court for arson. You burnt your own properties. And of course, he went to court. And the court jailed him and also fined him $24,000. Now, why have I told you these two stories? Two things have come out clearly when you look at climate change. We have a challenge with the concept of trust premised on historical antecedents. Parties don't trust themselves, premised on historical antecedents. And I'll make that clear in a moment. Secondly, we are all being too smart for ourselves. Developed nations and developing nations. And I'll make that also very clear in a moment. I will start with the structure of my presentation. That's my university. No, that's my university, the Lagos State University. I'm going to be looking at what is climate change, the consequences of climate change, impacts on governance, efforts at meeting the challenges of climate change, outcome of the efforts, the drivers producing the outcome that we have in hand now, while it will appear things are not working well, and what role for innovation and technology. In defining climate change, a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. I'll just make a joke in passing when there was a time we had extreme cold in the US, and the president, President Trump, came up and said, those who are talking about global warming should come and see how the environment is cold now. And of course, the distinction he failed to draw is that there's a difference between climate and weather. When you're talking about it is cold, you're talking about weather issues, which is just for a short period of time. But when you're talking about climate variability, it is something that has been on for several years. What are those critical things? Increasing global average temperature and climate effects. when you look at the records in relation to climate change, it dates back to 1850. And that will give you some 163 years or so that scientists over time, they have been measuring changes. So when people tell me that, is it real when we talk about climate change issues? I tell them, scientists looking at the records over a period of 163 years, they must have seen that there was some consistency over a period of time. And they must now be aware that something definitely is going wrong. And those who are probably seeing what we experience in terms of extreme heat and extreme cold in the last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, will know that something indeed is happening. June, for instance, was identified as the hottest period known to mankind since they have started measuring. June was identified as the hottest. When I was speaking with Chidi this morning, he said the kind of thing that has been identified for September, October, that it is something that is not commonplace. So we begin to see that there are some critical issues for us to be concerned about. What the world is looking at is we want to see whether we can stabilize at 1.5 degrees Celsius, but we don't want to go to the extent of 2 degrees Celsius, and that is the goal. That is why all of these issues are coming to the front burner now. Now, it is not as if greenhouse gases, which you are going to see in this next slide of mine, I'll just show them. When you talk about greenhouse gases, you're talking about carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons. Then I'll go back to that other slide. It is not as if we have a problem with greenhouse gases itself. Because without greenhouse gases, life on Earth itself will not be possible. Without greenhouse gases, if you look at the kind of weather that we have, or the kind of temperature that we have in terms of the average temperature, you'll be looking at minus 18 degrees. Meanwhile, the average that we have at different areas is 15 degrees Celsius. But if without the greenhouse gases, you have minus 18 degrees, which will not make our Earth habitable. But the major challenge that we're having is human interactions have disturbed the balance of what we have naturally. And that is why there's so much of concern that how do we manage the issues. I'm going back on this background so that we can just remind ourselves, and possibly for the benefit of those who have not been so much involved in climate change issues, to just have some view of it. Now, the last slide I showed there, consequences of climate change. Again, this is something I'm not going to belabor too much because it's something that all of us at different times, we have experienced it. Ecosystems, that is where you have the first huge consequences in terms of extreme weather patterns, the sweltering heat waves, rising sea levels, drought frequency and severity, melting ice caps, displacement. We are going to have refugees coming up very soon. Areas where we find their original habitats submerged. Eventually, they are going to become global citizens. So the question is, which country will they belong? Those are the kind of issues that will start coming up over time. Destruction of wildlife habitats, coral bleaching, and the rest of them. Of course, there are economic issues, loss of income, financial risk. And then the third one, magnifying inequalities. And I say that it is not just magnifying inequalities. Climate change issues are actually deepening inequalities. Climate change issues are deepening inequalities because those who don't have adaptive capacity and who are vulnerable to it, many of them are going down, particularly when you look at indigenous communities. So it's a huge challenge. When we talk about climate change, it may look esoteric when we sit in gatherings like this. It may look, oh, well, it was hot yesterday. Okay, it's going to be cold again today. It goes beyond that. It is when you interact with farmers. It is when you interact with those who are indigenous community people. It is when you interact with those who are losing their livelihoods. It is when you interact with those who are losing their habitats. That is when you realize that indeed there's something real in this whole thing. Briefly, we can look at the impact on governance. And it's the kind of thing I've said. When you're talking about governance, people's best interest coordinated effectively in a way that is equitable and fair. When you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you see that that actually is the goal of Sustainable Development, the SDGs. The goal is to ensure that people are able to have the best within the environment. I'm not talking about somebody being able to fly in the aircraft. I'm talking about somebody in his village, wherever he is, being able to live a normal human life wherever he finds himself or wherever he's living. That is the kind of thing that we're looking at. And then, of course, I've picked Agenda 2063, which is Africa's blueprint for transformation. Now, if you look at the middle of this diagram here, you see climate change indicated. The poor, the most vulnerable, those are the people who will be affected. Future generation unborn, of course, there's so much of issues that people have continued to raise in relation to it, but that is also there. Then degradation of the natural environment comes in. What are the things that are likely to happen? Human rights, right to life, right to health, right to housing, right to water and sanitation. All you need to do to experience some of these things is move away from your comfort zone. Take a trip to a place, a local community that you do not know, or a traditional environment that you do not know, and sleep a night there. It will give you an idea of some of these issues. I was speaking with Victoria yesterday. Victoria is a person who has gone around. She's moved in about 4 different African communities. And I asked her, how did you find these communities? He said, yes, many of these communities, beautiful, loving. But eventually you find out that most of what we see as our own priorities in the big cities are not their priorities. They just want to be able to live and enjoy basic human comfort. And those are the things that have been impacted, which is why there's a need for us to be concerned. The context of justice, I've explained it earlier, unequal contribution, which is why the framework for climate change adopted the common but differentiated responsibilities. Then, of course, it's also recognized unequal and disproportional vulnerabilities. Global politics and other complexities, as I will show in the course of the slides, are beginning to override the critical issues that we're talking about. But as I stated earlier, manifest injustice in the way climate justice is being confronted, which is why I am very much interested in this engagement of today. Now, what are the efforts at meeting the challenge of climate change? Very distinguished gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, 27 years of conferences since 1992 that the world has been at it in terms of trying to meet it. Reports, intergovernmental meetings, public debates, emphasis on dangers of climate change, all of that has been going on. Series of international environmental agreements has been signed. Regular comprehensive assessment reports by the IPCC, that is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm making reference to this IPCC. This is a body of scientists, and they've done so much work over the years in trying to educate people and give people guidance on what the issues are. Of course, as part of the framework agreement, mitigation measures, adaptation strategies, mitigation to reduce and curb the causes, and adaptation to be able to address the impact when they come in. Nationally determined contributions. I am not going to bore you with what I'm going to show you this first slide here. Realities on ground that tell another stories. I'm not going to bore you with what has been happening at the Conference of Parties, because year in, year out, you have what they call the COP, Conference of Parties. I'm not going to bore you. They have had so many of them. But what is critical about this slide that I showed you earlier? Because when you look at this slide, you will see that a lot of work has gone in globally in trying to assist in meeting the challenges of climate change. So much work has gone into it. But when you look at this slide, realities on ground that tells another story, the first thing there, the clear inability of developed and developing nations to overcome their differences. What is the challenge that they are having? Take a step back to 1992. what do you have? You have a situation where they recognized the problem, they wanted to come together to find a solution. And when they came together, the Climate Change Framework Agreement, UNFCCC document, 1992 was put in place. That document did not tell countries that this is what is expected of you in terms of the limits that you should put to your own emissions. But it put in place a mechanism for negotiation, i.e., negotiate from time to time, all the countries negotiate from time to time to be able to agree a way forward. So it was more like an umbrella document. Fast track from 1992 and moved to 1997 when Kyoto Protocol came into place. Kyoto Protocol went ahead and placed the responsibility to limit greenhouse gases on developed nations. When I say developed nations, I'm going to be talking about it in two contexts: developed nations, developing nations. So when Kyoto, I've told you that the framework document did not push in terms of putting limits. But when Kyoto Protocol came in, Kyoto just put the responsibilities on developed nations. Developed nations, you will go ahead and lead in terms of putting a lock on emissions, emission controls, discharge of greenhouse gases. The moment that happened, the problems started. Because when those countries that were leading it realized that a country like China, a country like India, that has enormous footprints in carbon, was not having any responsibility in terms of putting a curb on their emissions, they were not comfortable. And that was why a country like Canada has already opted out of Kyoto Protocol. In 2012, Canada said, I am backing out. And this was a leading nation in terms of it. So you begin to ask, what are those issues? I'm going to come to those issues in a moment. Again, you find a situation where Kyoto was supposed to operate from till 2012. And then they were going to have another agreement that would come in for the parties. But between 2012 till date, what they were grappling with was, let us just keep the countries focused for us to be able to negotiate another agreement that will start post-2020. We just keep everybody focused until then. Then in 2015, I've jumped so many things there. There were so many things that happened. Doha rounds, Copenhagen rounds, quite enough, Darfur rounds. I'm not going to talk about all of that. I'll just move in straight to 2015 when Paris Agreement came on board. And what Paris Agreement did was to move away from Kyoto Protocol. Moved away from Kyoto Protocol in the context of Kyoto Protocol was looking at developed nations. You will be the one that will lead in terms of responsibility. When Paris Agreement came into being, Paris Agreement now said, developed nations, developing nations, all of you will be involved. And then that was when they started the idea of nationally determined contributions, such that every one of you, it is for you to determine what you want to do. But you must give us a report every 5 years. You will come back and let us know, this is what I've determined for myself. The challenge with Paris Agreement, don't forget I said they have an interim arrangement now that is going to last till 2020. 2020, going forward from 2020, is what Paris Agreement is aimed at meeting. The challenge with Paris Agreement is that, one, it's a combination of soft laws, hard laws, non-binding provisions, all in the bid to satisfy the different parties in the framework. Two, you find out that it is resting heavily on good faith of nations. And one of the things that we all know, when you look at issues predicated on good faith of nations, it will be very difficult. Because at the end of the day, there's an adage in my country, give a madman a hoe, he will start working towards himself. So every country will still be concerned about themselves. And that is where the challenge of resting it on good faith lies. So the realities on ground that tells another story. Clear inability of developing nations and developed nations to overcome their differences. And it's the differences that I've just pointed out. Global emissions are reaching record levels with no sign of peaking. Let me give you just what some of the countries are doing at the moment. If you look at Japan, Japan is just investing about 26 billion into getting gas from the Arctic region. Yes, let me give you the statistics. The US is currently consuming 725 million tons of coal, 7.3 billion barrels of oil, and 23 trillion cubic feet of natural gas on a yearly basis. And we want them to move into renewable energy immediately before 2050. Those are some of the challenges that I'm going to come to in a moment. If you look at Japan, Japan has just invested 26 billion in trying to get natural gas from the Arctic. That is current investment that is being put. When you're talking about fossil fuel, which is the base of greenhouse, you're talking about oil, you're talking about natural gas, and then you're talking about coal. Those are the issues that you're looking at. So at the end of the day, you still have heavy investment going into all of this. Global emissions, and that is why global emissions has continued to be at its peak. As we're talking today, in spite of what has happened in the last 27 years, 80% of energy is still being supplied by fossil fuel, as we are talking today. Hydrocarbons continue to supply 80% of our needs. Further realities on ground. Renewables are facing serious legal battles. Renewables all over the world are facing serious legal battles. When you talk about NIMBYs and PIMBYs, you're talking about those who are saying windmills, for instance, I don't want it in my backyard. And when you talk about the PIMBYs, those who are saying, please bring it to my backyard. Those who are getting compensation are saying, bring it to my backyard. Those who are not getting compensation are saying, we don't want it in my backyard. There's so many of them who are complaining about human health issues, aesthetic impact, that bringing the windmills to our neighborhood has reduced the cost, the value that will ascribe to our premises. So those are some of the issues that you have. And then when you talk about green, you find a situation where you talk about hydrology. You're talking about biofuels. You're talking about biofuels, and you're talking about the effect on biofuels on food security. So you see a situation where there's a conflict in a number of things that are beginning to breed contradictions. And then, of course, the recent call by the UN Secretary General on world leaders to give concrete, realistic plans to enhance nationally determined contributions. In fact, what the UN Secretary General said when they were approaching the New York summit, he said, I don't want beautiful speeches. I want all of you to come there and be able to tell me in concrete terms what you are going to do. That, if you look at it critically, is a statement of somebody that is feeling very frustrated. That we all come here, we are turning it into a jamboree, we are not seeing the effects. And when you look at the young 16-year-old girl that came on to say a lot about the leaders, about what leaders, she also was just expressing the fears and concerns that you have stolen my dreams from me. Let's go further. The discomforting conclusion. Achieving a comprehensive or effective climate change regime has so far proved elusive. We have seen why, to some extent. But let us look at this in greater details. What are those things driving the complexities? And this is the area where we need to ask ourselves a question. The current strategy, if we continue to push it as it is without changing, would we ever be able to achieve our goals? That is the fundamental question that we're going to be asking ourselves now. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides, just about 6 of them, that are clear on what are those problems facing us. Countries are nervous about energy. Energy is politics. Anywhere you look at it, energy is politics. Because every activity that human being does, one way or the other, energy is implicated. And you see a situation where population is rising for so many countries. How are you going to tell China today that reduce your energy, reduce the way you use energy? It will be very difficult. How are you going to tell India? That is why US, all of them, they are really worried. I'm raising this not because I am accepting or rejecting what they are doing, but for us to realize the reality of what is on ground. Now, while you have developed countries who are concerned about that, developing countries are trying to play catch up. Their own attitude is, you have used this energy to bring yourself so much comfort to where you are now. We also need to do it. So it is not now that you should tell those of us who are just growing up, those of us who are just trying to catch up, it is not now that you tell us, reduce, don't use generators, use lantern. They are going to tell you that it is not going to happen. That what you did to bring yourself to where you are, let us also try to get there. It may not be the right attitude, but those are the kind of complications that you have politically. Now again, fossil fuel is cheaper and more dependable. Then you also look at the hijack. When I talk about the hijack, I'm looking at the hijack between energy democracy and dominant systems of energy. When you look at energy democracy very well, there are three different groups in that energy democracy enclave. You have those who are concerned about climate change, number one. You have those who are in themselves capitalists, and they believe that those of you with dominant energy, you have used this for so long, so it is now the turn of renewables. Those are arguments that are legitimate because they are entrepreneurs. They want to break into the market and they want to hijack the market so that energy will also be in their own forte. So you have them also. And then you have those whose environment has been polluted by oil pollution. And for them, it is not so much about climate change. It is much more of, we have our environment. If you go to the Niger Delta of Nigeria, for instance, you find a situation where some areas have been massively polluted. Nigeria is not alone. So many other countries where they are doing oil production, they have similar issues, similar stories to tell in relation to what is happening in the environment. So you see three clear people, three different agendas that they have, all of them singing the song of climate change. All of these, they have their implications. And then, of course, I've talked about Paris Agreement coming into operation in 2020. When you look at the uncertainty, with renewal of subsidy, nobody is sure of what is going to happen to subsidies. Subsidies in support of renewables. Nobody is sure of what is going to happen to it from post-2020 when the Paris Agreement is supposed to take off. So those are the challenges in relation to energy politics. Let us look at pitfalls of demonization. What has been the argument when you look at climate change? Overnight, we woke up and it was like, if you read quite a number of materials, it was like all of them that are involved in fossil fuel are demons. Now the question is this. Every one of us in this room, look at yourself. Who has not enjoyed so much the benefits of fossil fuel energy? Nobody. All the aircrafts we go with up and down, the vehicles we drive around, all of these issues are implicated. So I ask a question. Could our narrative have been different? Could we have been talking about research and development in relation to doing equitable and democratic end to fossil fuel production, as against demonizing fossil fuel industry? Because what has been the effect of going for the jugular and saying, we don't want the way you have been operating, you are creating a crisis for the world, and we want you to stop? So many things have happened. Skepticism, denialism, contrarianism, and cynicism. Quite a number of people are now in the field. When you read materials now about climate change, you don't even know what one to believe. When you read some of them in favor of climate change, you don't know whether it is fake. when you read some of them against climate change, you don't even know what to believe. Quite a number of scientists are coming up with all sorts of things, and it is creating a problem for global consensus. Dominant specters. There are certain dominant specters that we are all used to that will never go away. The historical legacy of emissions and attitude of developing countries. One of them a friend of mine, Joyita Gupta, in Netherlands. They did a work, and they came up with seven dimensions in relation to historical legacies of emissions. And when you listen to the 7 things they stated, you realize that it will be very difficult for us to achieve global consensus in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The first one, spatial. They stated, where first comers are the developed nations, late comers are the developing nations. Where first comers use their own resources and resources of other countries for their own development, leaving little environmental utilization space for late comers to develop. Because what they did was, they did a literature review of raging arguments in different materials and came up with these 7 conditions. I say these 7 dimensions. Second one, technological. When first comers dump older technologies on late comers, make no mistake about it. Electric cars that are coming in now, the diesel engine, the petrol engine will have to go to some other countries. It will go to Africa. It will go to other vulnerable societies. Make no mistake about it. So at the end of the day, the argument is not so much as if we're going to pack all of these equipments. We call them stranded assets. It's not as if we're going to pack all of these stranded assets and put them somewhere and destroy them. No, they will have to go to some other countries. Those other countries, are you telling me that they are not? No, we must be kidding to think that climate change is not there. It is a global thing. It is not just one nation. So you see a major problem, because somebody who has a car today who wants to change to electric car, he's not going to throw that car away. Whatever earning is able to get on that car, somebody who has a generator, and of course, in a number of African countries, a car that has been used for 5 years, 10 years here, in some families, in some vulnerable societies, where adaptive capacity is low, is like brand new cars. And that is the kind of thing. 5 more minutes. Woo. Economic. When first comers avoid paying compensation for damage caused to late comers for stranding. Ecological. When knowledge from first comers may prevent late comers from using their resources or may accelerate the rate at which their resources and assets become stranded. Political. When first comers refuse to take environmental action, claiming that late comers are not doing so, while late comers may claim that first comers should take action first. Legal and policy. When investment in resources and assets in a globalizing world involve long-term contracts protected under private law, may cause policy freezing and liabilities in latecomer countries. Social, when latecomers adopt different notions of development. So those are critical issues that our world will continue to face. And of course, when you talk about impact, you see, you must be able to differentiate individualistic cultures from collectivist cultures. When you look at these different cultures, you find out that when you talk about carbon pricing, tradable quotas, assignment of property rights, it is not the same meaning it has in a culture where it is individualistic that it will have in a culture where it is collectivist. So you see that creating a problem also. Matters of trust, I've already talked about it. One of the things that the UN has not been able to do, the democracy that the UN is pushing for everybody in the world, they have not been able to bring it within the UN. And that has continued to create a lot of problems. Well, science, not just existential threat, that is another challenge. Transforming renewables to usable energy. These are the various challenges that you have with it. Existing limited in functionality. Renewable energy not competitive without government subsidies. Now, I'll go to, these are the uncertainties. Of course, I talked about the intellectual property deadlock that is hamstringing technology to go to some of these communities that are vulnerable. And then I mentioned here the global distractions. There are quite a number of distractions that is taking the shine away from climate change. When you talk about the US, China, Russia issue, ecosystems of Islamophobia, far-right nationalism, and the rest of them, then corruption and pervasive democratic deficiencies in some of these other climes too. So these are things that are distracting from being able to focus on climate change. Now, what role for innovation and technology? And I'll just talk about this for 5 minutes and close my mouth. What role for innovation and technology? Complexity of life is the more you solve, the more that comes to the fore to be resolved. Why then have we not been able to solve the climate change challenge? I will look at innovation first. And when you look at this diagram on innovation, what do you see? Basic research is the function of government to entrench that. But when you look at the number of governments, for lack of a better word, I've used inactive, but they have not been functional in terms of cost, infrastructures, low capital turnover, market organization. Research and development is the work of the firm to bring that in terms of commercialization. But you see that donor funding is what is determining the kind of technology that should go into several communities. And what does that tell us? When you look at a number of indigenous communities, the kind of technology that is going there is not what they need in those communities. And they are being funded into those communities. So when we say that we are looking at technology meeting the challenges of climate change, either in the context of mitigation or in the context of adaptation, and that is where I'm talking about the narrative, that what we are pushing is unwittingly going to be injustice on these systems. Because you find out that what we are actively funding at the level of international communities, at the level of donor agencies, what we are actively funding are not what some of these communities require. Key elements. When you look at technology, of course, all the basic things that you should have in the materials for technology, UNFCCC has it. Technology needs information, enabling environment, it has it. But the linkage is it what is required in several of these communities that are going to them? In terms of funding, of course, you see there, all of the arrangements that should assist to fund are there. But what you find, as I stated earlier, is that funding is going to what is of interest to the funder, to the donor. And that is not what quite a number of communities need in terms of being able to adapt in terms of the mitigation issues. I've done a grouping of CC climate change technologies in terms of what you need, the kind of technology you are going to be looking at for mitigation, and that you'll be looking at for technologies. But I will not hold on to that for too long. Now, understanding the challenges. Many of them, in terms of climate change technologies, I've talked about it. Many of them are not able to compete without subsidy, at least for now. And then, of course, the focus is more on creating conditions for foreign investment in the vulnerable countries. There's a slide that is very important to me, and that is the slide that I want to focus on. Because my own view of technology should be co-evolution and co-creation of indigenous technologies, domestication of technology. This is where the focus should be. This is where global focus should be. How do you aggressively achieve co-evolution and co-creation of indigenous technology? If you are able to achieve it, what do you get? Local ownership models that give stability, local cultural lifestyle that gives legitimacy, affordability and ease of diffusion of the technologies. Those are the kind of things that you will achieve. Reflections moving forward, and that is my closing slide. The basic facts: as long as poverty remains a scourge, meeting the challenge of climate change is like ignoring leprosy to treat rash. Meanwhile, if you bring the right technology to a system, if innovation in a system is what is legitimate to that community, you are going to be meeting the challenges of poverty as you are meeting the challenges of climate change. Because SMEs will be strengthened when you go into the local communities. SMEs and the small companies will be strengthened, and that is the kind of thing we should be looking at. So I said, continue global focus on achieving legally binding or non-binding emission targets will not yield much unless we change that perspective. Emphasis should be deepen education and awareness of the consequences, impact of climate change, reorientate towards a culture of less emissions. A lot is being done now, is ongoing now, but we need to focus on these areas, education and awareness, not funding mitigation technologies developed in some other areas for everybody. No one size will fit all. Achieve radical change in technology governance, and this is that last slide. What do I mean about achieving radical change? That is poverty there. The radical change will come from leadership and governance, global and national level. Markets, because I said earlier that cultural worldview differs, and because of that, markets must also be sensitive to the way worldview differs. Cultures, if you don't engage community experiences and indigenous knowledge, we cannot go far in this conversation. We cannot go far. 30% of those who are members of the United Nations, 30% are African countries. So you see that quite a lot of them are there. I'm not talking about, I'm only using Africa as a case study. I'm talking of all the scattered indigenous communities all over the globe. So I'm only using Africa as I'm not limiting it to Africa. So you need the critical input into innovation and technology regimes from this. What are those critical support? I've given examples of some of them. Extraction to production manufacturing value chain, plant to livestock production value chain, market and supply chain leakages, IPR for indigenous knowledge open access arrangements, energy innovations, soil analysis for purpose of planting and grazing, seed matching to soil weather conditions, fertilizer blending to match soil. These are some of the areas where technology can begin to grow very effectively in relation to these communities. And of course, when you look at the other end there, in terms of leadership and governance, what will it offer? Ethics and accountability, legal, institutional, and coordination mechanisms. Why do I talk about legal institutional coordination? You see it in one of my earlier slides. Quite a number of governments, when you look at them, they still have very well structured in their laws issues relating to economic goals overriding environmental issues. That is what they still have in their extant laws. So you're telling them, embrace this, when their law, their policies are saying something different. It has to be a comprehensive thing. Otherwise, the handshake will not be effective. Innovation laboratories, technology incubator centers. These are the kind of things that that global community should be looking at, and national bodies should also be looking at. And then this last slide, this is my last slide. This is a project. This is a project that the World Bank is doing now with some African universities. And what did they do? They said we are going to set up centers of excellence in some universities. And they asked the universities, think through what are the local challenges that you think you have a unique capacity to be able to develop yourself, develop postgraduate programs in that area. Think through it, come and defend it. If you successfully defend it, we will fund it working together with your government. And at the end of the day, my university bidded for it. About 450 institutions in Africa bidded. And at the end of the day, they chose about 45 or less than 50. And we were one of those who won them. And what is it that we were able to achieve? We were able to show them that if you come in this area with us, we can actually develop thinking undergraduate programs in certain critical areas. And these are the different areas that different institutions have come up with. Some said genomics and infectious diseases. It will be of interest that S1, one of the institutions that was involved, was able to come out with a vaccine in relation to Ebola. One of the institutions that was involved in Nigeria was able to come up with that. That is allowing the system to come up with its own grown technologies, getting the support of the system. These are the different areas that has been covered at the end of the day. What is my conclusion? If the global community is to, sorry, I must mention something in that last slide before I read this conclusion. The conception of this project, as I stated, is not dominated or directed by the World Bank. It is the institution working together within its own national environment that comes up to say, these are the things we can do. And then they send a team of experts to come and interact with them and guide them along that path. So you see that in the course of this, they will be able to set up technology, they will be able to get the kind of equipment that they need to push the frontiers of whatever they are doing. And they will also be able to develop the skill sets that they will need in those areas. And you see a situation where working together, they can even complement each other's efforts. So my conclusion, if the global community is to delink injustice from climate justice, then there is an urgent need for a radical change in climate change innovation and technology governance, markets and cultures. The world of today is about truly sharing. And why do I say the world of today is about truly sharing? A person can meet you for advice and is talking to you, and you pretend that you are listening, and you are not listening. Make no mistake about it. He may not tell you because he's seeking your favors, but he knows that you are not listening. Because your body language, your eye flicking, everything will show that you are not listening. The same thing with sharing. If you are not sincerely sharing, everybody will know that you are not sincerely sharing. And it is something that should permeate everybody. It is not the developed nations alone. Everybody must be ready to share views and work together. I thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.